rights throughout history, life after slavery. If you remember from our last lesson, we looked at the history of the women's rights movement, and we talked about things women did to try and secure their rights in the United States, and we focused on the right to vote. We're looking at a different group of people in this lesson. In this lesson, we're going to focus on African Americans and minorities, who are groups that have had their rights taken from them or never given to them in the first place throughout American history. And we will look at how that has evolved during American history. So our objective is to describe the roles of African Americans in history and how they came to fight for civil rights in the 1960s. So similar to what we did when we learned about women, we're looking at where African Americans were in the past, how their struggle and fight for rights evolved over time, and then in the homework you'll look at some things about today. Remember, the focus is on seeing how people have used rights that we have in the Constitution to gain other rights. Our essential question is, how did minorities gain the right to vote in the 1800s, but not truly able to use it until the 1960s? So we'll look at how people used rights to gain other rights. So you've probably heard of slavery, but what was it exactly? Slavery was a system of slavery in which one human being was owned. In which one human being owned another as property. This meant that if you were a slave, you were not technically considered a person. You were considered property, and the property of another person. Why did they do this? It was a system of labor. If you had slaves, you had workers. So they were seen as tools, essentially, for plantations and farms, especially in the southern part of the country. How long were you a slave? It was a lifelong condition, meaning once you became a slave, you were a slave for your entire life. If you were born to a slave, you yourself were a slave as well. Could you get out of slavery? It was possible. You could escape. Some people were lucky enough to buy their freedom and move elsewhere. Some people would be let go or freed by whoever owned them. That happened at times, but for the most part, if you were a slave for your entire life. They often faced cruel and brutal treatment. They faced racism and discrimination. And the conflict over slavery is what eventually caused the Civil War, one of the major causes. If you don't know what the Civil War is, it was a war between the northern part of the United States and the southern part of the United States. And it was mainly about slavery and whether or not it should exist. The North won that war, and that's why we don't have slavery anymore. So right after the Civil War, amendments were passed. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And these amendments are called the Reconstruction Amendments. They were supposed to get rid of slavery and provide equality to African Americans or newly freed slaves. That's what they were designed to do. So I'll quickly kind of tell you what they did. The 13th Amendment got rid of slavery. It made slavery illegal in the United States. The 14th Amendment made African American citizens guaranteed equal protection under the law, meaning that they were supposed to have the same rights as anybody else in the country. And the 15th Amendment guaranteed African American males the right to vote, not women yet. So the 15th Amendment guaranteed African American males the right to vote. So all these amendments were passed in the 1860s and 1870s. So a very long time ago, 140 years. So all these things were passed in the 1860s and 70s. But it's not going to be until much, much later, with Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement, that these amendments truly go into effect, at least fully. So what kind of caused all that? How come African Americans didn't get their full rights right after the Civil War and right after slavery ended? There was a court case in 1896 called Plessy versus Ferguson. And what happened in this case was this guy wanted to sit on a train. And the train was, and he was an African American man, actually only part African American. But he sat on the train, and he sat in a car, that was supposed to be for white people only. And when he sat in the car, and he didn't do this as like a protest or anything like that, he literally just went and sat in a car and on a train and thought it'd be okay. He was moved from the train because he was sitting in a section that was supposed to be for whites only. So it goes all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court's trying to figure out, is that okay? Is it okay to separate people based on race? And the Supreme Court of the United States decided that yes, it was okay. And that creates the idea of being separate but equal, meaning that we can be kept separated based on race. So white people and African American people can be kept separate, but the facilities that we have and use need to be equal. For example, like if you see the picture that's up on the board there's a bunch of them. You can see some of the sections. The most famous thing that usually comes up when they're trying to show people what segregation was like is drinking fountains. So there'd be a sign, and on the left-hand side would be a drinking fountain for white people, and on the right-hand side would be a drinking fountain for everybody else. And you can see that in some of the other pictures as well. So that's what separate but equal means. They both get a drinking fountain, so that's the idea of it being equal, but they have to be separate drinking fountains. That's what separate but equal means. And then southern states passed laws that legalized segregation, known as Jim Crow laws. They tried to make it easier for businesses and organizations to separate people based on race. So again, this is 1896. We got a ways to go until Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement, over 60 years. What did they do to try and end some of these things that were going on? Similar to what women did. They protested. They used freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of petition, all these things that we have for protest for the point of changing things that are wrong in this country. They used those to try and change things. And not just African Americans. They had allies from every group and every race helping them in the civil rights movement. You can see what they're doing in some of these pictures. They faced violence. They faced attacks. You can see that very famous picture in the bottom left. That boy is being attacked by dogs that are under the control of police officers. They faced very, very harsh conditions in their protests. The pictures that you just saw are pictures of the civil rights movement. And it was an effort to try and stop all of the things that were happening that we've talked about on previous slides. Keeping people separate based on race, making it hard for African Americans to vote. It was a movement to try and change all of that. And they used all of those rights that we've been talking about to try and change that. Did it work? We've seen this picture before in live class. In 1964, this is 100 years after the Civil War. About 100 years after the Civil War. Almost 100 years after the end of slavery. Think about that. That's a long time. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed. A lot of people did not want it to pass, but the president at the time, his name was Lyndon B. Johnson, helped Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement get it passed. What did it do? It gave Congress power to outlaw segregation in most public places. It gave minorities equal access to facilities such as restaurants and theaters. So it made it so the federal government or the national government in Washington, D.C. could go into small communities and cities and states and actually stop segregation from happening. It gave them the power to do that. So if you're a restaurant in Maryland and you decide that you're not going to allow African Americans into your restaurant, the federal government can step in and stop you. What else happened during the Civil Rights Movement? The 24th Amendment was passed. The 24th Amendment, which was ratified in 1964, same year as the Civil Rights Act, helped to guarantee the right to vote for African Americans. So it got rid of a couple things that were stopping African Americans from voting. As we talked about before, if you wanted to vote, you had to pay a poll tax, which was literally money you had to pay to vote. It got rid of that and made it a lot easier for African Americans and people across the country that just couldn't simply afford to pay to vote. It made them easier for them to vote because they didn't have to pay anymore. Also, as we talked about before with the March in Selma, and we've talked about the movie that recently came out about that, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed. So these 2 years, 1964 and 65, were very, very big for the advancements of rights in the United States. President Johnson, the same guy, he saw what was going on in Selma, and he had the federal government step in. And after that, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed and signed into law. And it authorized the federal government, again, to send in people to make sure that nothing wrong or fishy was going on with voting in certain parts of the country. So if you were in a small town in Virginia and you weren't letting African Americans vote for whatever reason, from the federal government could come in and see that you were doing that and stop it. So that's a very brief history of the struggle for rights for minorities in this country with a specific focus on African Americans. We'll look more at what's going on today with minorities and African Americans in the homework that is posted underneath of this lesson. Remember, this isn't the full story, but it's a story to give you a basic idea of what that struggle was like. Is it still going on today? Some would argue yes, some would argue no. That's up for you to decide. I don't think that we are all truly equal, and it'd be tough for someone to argue that, I think. And you'll see more about that in the homework. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. Make sure you answer the questions that are underneath of this video. If you don't have any questions, good luck.